I think we've learned a lot since 2011 that you can remove Mubarak, but that doesn't remove an underlying system and an underlying dynamic. And what you're seeing now is people realizing that you need to get rid of an entire system and not just a single leader. David Kenner, I think that you are seeing this broad indictment of the political class in Lebanon that you saw with the U-Stick movement.
There's a leaderless component this time around, which we haven't seen before. Even during the U-Stick crisis, there was leadership. There were names, and you could point at certain people and say they are leading this. For the time being, it's been now, I think, 38 days since this revolt began, and there's no sign of a figure emerging yet, or for that matter, a team, or there's no group that has sort of taken on that mantle. And do you think that this type of momentum can sustain itself without leadership forming? Because it's so fluid at the moment, and it seems like the strength is in that it's leaderless. But do you see this as something that can translate to political power?
I mean, it's a great question. I think the leaderlessness of this current moment is in some ways a reaction to the fact that leadership of the U-Stick movement did arise, and that created some tensions within the movement. And I think some of the current organizers and current people involved look back at that as a mistake because it ended up sapping energy from it. Look, I mean, I think it's a bug and a feature. It's a feature in the way that everyone is organizing their own social groups. Everyone is taking part in this sort of organically. And I mean, that's amazing. I mean, the bug part of it is it becomes harder to figure out how you get people to the streets when you need it. And it becomes a little harder to figure out how you develop a political agenda and what you actually want when there's no one that can speak for the movement as a whole.
Right. So in a sense, it's too early to tell what this will turn into maybe a few weeks or months from now. I'm certainly watching, but I don't presume to know what's going to happen. The Tahrir moment in 2011 in Egypt, which you covered, that moved quickly. It moved within... I mean, it was just 3 weeks, and the regime, or the face of the regime, fell. Tunisia was very quick. Libya, it sort of degenerated into something else. But the fact that it was it seemed so rapid, and it fit my superficial understanding of what a revolution requires, which is speed, momentum, and immediate change. It doesn't seem like that's the case here. It's technically still the same government. The protests are ongoing, but other than the resignation of the prime minister, I believe now 3.5 weeks ago, there hasn't been much political change, at least in what we call the Lebanese state and all its entities. It's just the prime minister's resignation. Do you sense that that's an obstacle in terms of just keeping things moving forward, that it can take 2 months or maybe longer to see another person resign, or perhaps no one else resigns? I'm just curious about the actual what's required in a revolution, because it seems like Lebanon's definitions for everything, there's always a caveat to the story, and revolutions here are very different than revolutions next door, or for that matter throughout the region. So what is your take on that, just in terms of the amount of time it's taking to see change?
Right.
And not from the protesters, but from the state, from the political class.
Yeah, it's interesting that to me there seem to be two different stories that are going on, and they're tangentially related to each other, but are sort of going in different paths. One is the popular demonstrations and the popular reaction, and the other is sort of the official reactions, which sometimes seem to be occurring in its own world.
And we saw what looked like a scuffle, parliamentarians unable to reach parliament, protesters preventing the quota, but that was it. It's not like the parliament resigned or the protesters stormed the parliament.
Yeah. I mean, to me, what is more important is looking at the popular reaction and the popular organization, whether you're seeing the creation of sort of new popular movements that can sort of tackle some of Lebanon's systemic problems regarding sectarianism, regarding the economic situation, regarding class divides in the country. On the official level, I mean, obviously, as you said, it's not moving very fast at all, right. And the reaction is, I mean, the situation's fairly stagnant. I would say that's less important, other than the fact that Lebanon is facing a fairly massive economic crisis. And without an official reaction to that, you're going to see a worsening situation, which is going to affect the popular movement in major ways that we don't quite know yet.
Right, and that the fact that we haven't actually crashed yet.
Right.
It seems like an inevitability, but we haven't really hit bankruptcy for the moment.
If you start seeing an official devaluation of the pound, if you start seeing the banks taking a haircut on deposits, I mean, that is going to add fuel to the protests, but it's also going to add a ton of anger. And I mean, who knows what directions they take. That's really could change sort of the mood in the country.
Now, stepping out from Lebanon and looking at the region, last few weeks, Iraq has had similar images emerging. Of course, the death toll is higher. Fortunately, only one protester has, and I don't want to say it fortunately, it is quite, it's relieving that only one protester has died in Lebanon, but hundreds have been killed in Iraq, perhaps more. Iran seems to be under blackout. We don't know exactly what's going on, but there is a violent reaction to the state there. Do you sense that all these countries, and we can even include northern Syria, which has had protests in the last few days, do you think that these are all similar grievances that are being expressed at the same time? Or is this a movement against a status quo that has a geopolitical component? And what I mean by that is, do Iraqis want economic reform, and are they fighting corruption the way we are here? Are Iranians doing the same thing? Or is there a struggle against perhaps the powers that have been preserving their sway in the region? And this is as speculative and subjective as possible, because at times it seems like this is sincerely a local grievance, and then other times you do see layers that overlap.
Right.
When it comes to geopolitics.
Yes, they have similar grievances. And those similar grievances, the fact that they have similar grievances and there are similarities in the countries are a product of the fact that there is a sort of an international geopolitical reality in this region that has created similar circumstances in all these countries.
Right.
I do not buy the thesis that all of these people in the different countries are sort of revolting against the Iranian regime per se. This isn't driven by a dislike of the people in power in Tehran. Yeah. But
we don't even see that in the slogans.
Right.
If they're there, they're fringe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That said, there is a political reality in a lot of Middle East countries that is created, a political and economic reality, by a whole range of actors, from Iran to Saudi Arabia to the United States to Russia. I mean, this has created a common economic and political grievances in all these countries. So
the fact is that it's interesting to see it as both, and that they just happen to line up this way for the time being. But do you sense that there is a strategic threat to that status quo, that you could see something else replacing Iran's influence in the region as a result of local grievances? When you look back at Lebanese history, you see a lot of examples of legitimate popular outrage being seized upon by international actors or local actors for their own purposes. In fact, it's hard to think of a situation where legitimate popular grievances weren't seized on by those actors for their own purposes. It is hard to think of a situation where
popular demonstrations and popular anger, and that led to political change, did not come through violence.
Yeah.
And that's not a happy reality. That's a super grim reality. But yeah, absolutely, it could have geopolitical consequences.
And what would you speculate Iran's reaction to that? I mean, because we saw a local reaction to the protesters several weeks ago. We saw counter-protesters ransack Martyrs Square and burn tents to the ground. And then the reaction from the protesters was simply put those tents back and not fall into that sectarian way of reacting.
Which was great.
Which, in a way, maybe saved the momentum and saved the protests from degenerating into what could have been real violence. Kullun yani kullun outweighed any other chant. Yesterday, we saw a very, very small version of that. We saw the revolution sign burned to the ground in Martyrs Square. So this is not really geopolitical. These are very local and perhaps a few blocks radius within Beirut. But if Iran were to sense that its status and its power that it has seized on and it's sort of worked very hard to preserve, if that were to be threatened by these levels of economic anger and all that we're seeing, do you think that potential violence is on the horizon as a result of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think and I don't want to just speak about Iran here, I think any international actor is not going to just let its equities in Lebanon disappear without a fight. I mean, speaking about Lebanon, I mean, I lived in Lebanon in May 2008. I mean, we saw what happened when Iran and its allies consider its proxies threatened in Lebanon. I don't know if that would work again, but sure, I think it would be foolish to say that people weren't worried. People are absolutely worried, and God, I hope it doesn't go in that direction, but sure.
So, that is in a sense, we know what it looks like, and we've lived through it. It didn't turn into civil war, but it did turn into a battle that cost lives, and Lebanon was on edge. And there is that threat is on the horizon, that if Hezbollah, or for that matter, any group here that is financed and influenced by another country, that if their positioning was threatened, we may see a repeat of that. Do you sense that the protesters see it this way at all? And I mean it in terms of that Hezbollah has not really been brought up, or its weapons have not been brought up. Countries have not been discussed on the ground. It's really just pure economics and politics and very grassroots. Do you think that that's the strength of this moment, that because it's not being addressed, it may be even more threatening to the status quo?
I mean, Kulon Yani Kulon is been such an effective slogan for the protesters because it is all-encompassing. But I am very interested to see what happens when or if the movement starts to get more specific. Like, Fuad Senora is corrupt. Maybe Fuad Senora should go on trial. I'm just picking a name at random.
We've seen snippets of that. Najim Miati's name was thrown out. Yeah,
of course. And if that happens, if it happens to Senora, do Sunnis in the protest movement start saying, "Hey, why isn't this happening to Randa Berry? Why is it just our guy?" Or if it happens to just take a reverse example, Ali Hassan Khalil. Why isn't it happening to
the other side?
Yeah, the other side. Yeah. I mean I think Kulon Yani Kulon has been extremely effective to this moment, but I am interested to see what happens when the rubber meets the road and we try to translate those slogans and this popular momentum into actual steps of political change.
Right.
Because I think that's going to be a very fraught moment. Can you both tackle? Can you tackle all these different actors at the same time, or is there going to have to be an order? And once that order is set, you're going to start antagonizing certain segments. I honestly have no idea.
Let's take it a step further and leaving the region and America's posturing towards all that's happening in this part of the world.
Sure.
Jeffrey Feltman was testifying in Congress. I think David Welsh was also testifying. The Americans have nominally supported the protests in the region. There's also been a reluctance to send money to the army. I think it's still frozen.
It is.
And there's almost an internal problem within the administration. The White House doesn't want that money. State Department does. But the bigger picture, American interest in the region, does any of this cause concern to the Americans? Mm-hmm. So in other words, security, diplomacy, terrorism, all the things that America would be concerned about here. Is any of that an issue for the moment? Mm-hmm. Whether it's Lebanon, Iraq, Iran. And I'm just curious what the Americans are wanting from this situation. And I know that you have written about American policy in the region. I know
Sure.
that. I'm just curious your perspective on that front.
There are two questions here, and one of them I think very few people know, and the other I can speak to. The one very few people know is what the White House or the U.S. government are thinking about the Lebanon protests exactly, and why the aid is frozen. Yeah. I don't know the answer to that exactly. The second thing that I know more about, having sort of directed foreign policy's Middle East coverage for a long time, is how American officials broadly think about Lebanon and how the American media covers Lebanon. And in my experience, especially this present moment, they really do see the protest through the prism of Hezbollah. Does this represent a threat to Hezbollah? Does it represent renunciation of Iran among the Lebanese populace? And how can we sort of use this as leverage to achieve our policy goals there?
Right.
And I think that sometimes leads to analytical mistakes, as in seeing these protests as solely regarding Iranian hegemony or Hezbollah's weapons, when that is not at all what I hear in Lebanon. But it really is seen through the prism of Hezbollah, which is sort of the main American item on the policy agenda in Lebanon.
So as long as it either antagonizes or even for that matter could potentially enhance Hezbollah's role, that's the prism.
I have not had one discussion with a friend in Washington or a policymaker about systemic corruption in Lebanon, or the failures of the recent democratic election. I mean, the failures of democracy. I think those issues generally are considered peripheral by people in Washington to their own detriment, frankly.
And that's been a consistency, whether it's the Obama administration or the Trump administration. I don't remember the Arab Spring, the economics being top on the list when it came to concerns.
Absolutely.
It was more state security.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You've seen reactions to secularism and sectarianism, and largely both have failed in terms of social contracts in other countries in this part of the world. We saw the Arab Spring. We saw true sectarian war in Iraq. So I'm curious what you think is on the horizon, and where you think Lebanese stand today in that dichotomy.
A lot of Lebanese will tell you they're against sectarianism. My guess is if you did a poll of Lebanon and ask people, are you in favor of sectarianism or against sectarianism? You'd probably get a pretty strong majority that said against sectarianism. I am secular, we want a secular system.
Right.
But that hasn't translated into change because there's always the question of, gee, this is what I believe. Is my neighbor going to give it up too? Or are they going to stick to their sectarian leaders and essentially eat up all the parts of the pie while I'm essentially giving up support from my sectarian leaders? And so, I mean, I think that's what's greatly inspirational about this current moment of protest, in that people are saying, no, I'm ready to take that leap. No, the situation isn't serving anyone, and anyone who is sticking to their sectarian leaders are dupes, essentially, for doing so. That they're that you're holding the country back, and that if I don't take the leap, we're all gonna be held back. So I think that's hugely inspiring, and you are seeing symbols of that in Iraq too.
Right, and it seems like, yes, that it's the first time that you see real momentum for it. And I like the way that you described that. You take a poll, and maybe 90% want something else.
Yeah,
but it's not really tested.
Right.
What communal relationships would look like without that pluralism among communities within government.
Right.
And after talking to many people that speak highly of the power sharing model, it took me time to adjust my thinking. I do see that there is something there that Lebanon's pluralism stands out, the breathing space among communities. That might be sectarianism's best achievement in Lebanon. Everything else failed, including economics, and I mean every other item on the plate has been an abysmal failure. But pluralism has survived, and it survived war, it survived chaos, it survived bankruptcy, it survived many things, it survived history, and it's still there. And I'm always wondering what the power sharing would look like if we were to really sort of address it head on. And it's something that I'm always very curious about, because I think our generation, I want to put you as a Lebanese compatriot here, since you're married.
I wish I was.
Well, you are. You should be Lebanese.
Sadly, the law.
Yeah, that's true. We're fighting to change.
Please,
so we're fighting to make you Lebanese, David Kenner.
Oh God.
But I wonder. I mean, I think we're maybe the last generation that has fear from the war, and it's not from our own eyes. It could be from our parents telling us the war was fought and sectarianism was central to it.
Right.
And even if that's not necessarily true all the time, but sectarianism and the war are sort of combined. This younger generation that we see on the streets, I don't think they have active memory, and I think their parents are less concerned with it. It seems like for the first time you may see a form of secularism which is unusual in Lebanon entering the public sphere. And
right. What you just said jibes with my own experience, that there is a generational divide here, and sort of 1990 serves as a pretty good cutoff point.
Yes.
I look at it as a double-edged sword in some ways. I mean, in some ways you sometimes want to tell the younger generation, like, look, this can get really bad,
exactly.
Right? At the other time, they're right. I mean, the political model that has been created in Lebanon from the civil war has not served anyone well. And bravo for them for taking to the streets and trying to change it. Yeah. And that's a constant tension in the way that I think about the country.
Yeah. Your work in Saudi Arabia.
Of course.
I'm curious what you think Saudi Arabia's concerns are today for its vested interests. And I mean it in not just necessarily supporting a politician in Lebanon or perhaps helping the central bank at times or the economy, just in terms of the way Saudi Arabia views these protests. Do you think that they are happy what they're seeing on the streets, or do you think they're worried? Do their views line up with Iran, paradoxically, that they see unrest as potentially destabilizing for them as well?
So while I am more focused on economics and my fellowship centers on economic change within Saudi Arabia, just in the context of my position at the King Faisal Center there, I do have conversations with Saudis about what's going on in Lebanon. So I could speak about that, though it is certainly not the official Saudi government stance on anything. In my sense, like the Americans, they see it through the prism of Hezbollah and Iran.
Oh, interesting. So in a way,
there's a very similar attitude toward, as the Americans, toward these protests, which are these bad for Hezbollah? Does this represent a repudiation of Iran? And to the degree that it does, the Saudis are quite happy with the current moment. There is also no love lost from my interlocutors with Saad Hariri. They see him as sort of a weak leader who has sort of refused to confront Hezbollah head on, and that has meant that they are perfectly happy to see his government fall.
It's a marked shift from just a few years ago, where the Saudis still sort of did play a role in this country, that they're, in a way, just waiting to see what happens to Hezbollah, and that's their concern. Less to do with particular names, or for that matter, the economy. It's really now about security as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there might be more things happening in the Saudi government that I'm not privy to, because, again, it's not the focus of my research. But I think they felt let down by their allies in the country and their failure to confront Hezbollah and Iran.
Yeah.
And at some level, wash their hands of that situation. Yes.
So really the only regional power that is potentially sort of seeing its influence at stake is Iran. That it's really just about them now when it comes to real concern about these protests. All other countries seem to be just waiting and seeing whether or not Iran's assets will be damaged.
Yes, my sense from my conversations, the Saudis will not see the fall of the present government as a loss for them, but a loss for Iran.
We met over 13 years ago.
We did.
And we were both students of Middle East studies at AUB. And we took courses together. We were friends. We're still friends.
We still are.
But we were kids compared to what's happening now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm just curious about your own opinions on Lebanon and the region. When you first came here and you were curious about the region and you were a political science student and I remember you had a blog and you were approaching it through studying and offering your own opinions from a sort of a fresh slate.
Yes.
13 years later, do you see your own views shifting? And I'm just this is more like a subjective journey. That has this region made you approach the Middle East differently just by studying it and living here?
I mean, when I look back at sort of the seminal moments of my time in the Middle East, I think of May 2008, and I think of 2013 in Egypt, the coup, which I covered from Rabat Square, which are not happy moments.
Yes.
And I don't want to be like the entirely cynical, but I think I was extremely naive when I came to this part of the world in thinking sort of that the arc of history bends toward justice, that, things were inexorably getting a little better day by day and there would be roadblocks. But that at the end of the day, these sort of stagnant autocracies could not survive. And I don't think I believe that anymore. That's super depressing and a super depressing note to end on. But I do think that I came in from sort of a very ideological place that eventually this place will come closer to my sense of what is just and fair and equitable. And I think today I'm more at a place where I try to make less judgments and try to understand people a little better about what their perspective is and how their perspective fuels their political choices, if that makes sense.
So in a way, it's become a localized journey as opposed to a sort of not necessarily American policy, but just sort of that universal yearning for justice. And you've become, in a way, you've seen it through the eyes of the locals.
Yeah, let me put it this way. I came at it thinking I have this idea of what a better country or a better region looks like. And it's my sense that over time, the world is going to look more like that.
Right.
And that I think is very naive. I think a better way to look at it is to try to figure out, okay, what are the people in this country? What are the people in this part of the world, this region, this city, this district, whatever? How do they perceive the world around them? How do they perceive the conflicts around them? And taking that seriously as the factors that shape the region.
Simply because your work has allowed you to see it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had a lot of experience. The conflict in Syria, the situation in Lebanon does not look the same to a Lebanese, a Lebanese in a southern village, to a Lebanese in Ashrafiyya, to someone else. And it's them at the end of the day who sort of shape the popular reaction to things, not me with sort of pie-in-the-sky thoughts about how the country should be.
True. But I'll flip that now and ask you, have your views on America changed now that you've spent the better part of 13 years away from the States? Do you see America differently? And I mean, I'm not talking just about Trump. I'm talking about just a general emotion towards America and American politics.
I think when I came to Lebanon, well, to get the timeline, I moved to Turkey in 2005 and moved to Beirut in 2006. At that point, the Iraq War was at its height, and there was still attitude among Americans, I think, that we could fix things, that all we can have a sort of made in America solution to these things. That I think unconsciously I sort of adopted those attitudes that, gee, the United States could sort of put a solution in a box and transfer that box to Iraq or to Lebanon and really sort of push change into in a positive directions. I think over the past 13 years, I have sort of become disabused of that notion and the degree to which the United States can change these places. Yeah. And sometimes when I go back to the United States, I am struck by a degree of disagreement with people who think there are easy, pat, made in America solutions to these places. Because I think the simple truth is that there are a lot of these issues that the United States simply can't fix.
But that's not because of what looks like disengagement, whether it's the Obama administration or Trump. That is simply America's limits on power. Did I get that right? That it's less to do with the presidents or the administrations. It's actual what America can and cannot do.
Yes, I think there are. I'm not speaking sort of here about one administration. I'm speaking about sort of an appreciation of the limits of American power and also the limits of American knowledge about these places. Right. I think there is a tendency among Americans. Probably, I mean, among a lot of foreigners. If I lived in Moscow, I bet you'd see this among Russians. Right. That to oversimplify what's happening in these countries, I think that leaves out a lot of context.
Well, I'm glad that we've known each other this long to have this kind of conversation and reflection. Thank you for your time, David, and I appreciate your reflections on a place you call home.
Thank you so much, and hopefully in 13 years we'll be doing this again about the United States, and I'll be asking you the questions.
Oh, Jesus. Well, let's give it 13 years and see what happens. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Ronnie. This is a pleasure.